understand. They just don't meet good people from communities other than the ones that they're raised in. And they're too timid or scared or lack the courage or benefit, financially, reputationally by closing doors and by defining against the other right now. But I think we got to make the Bible, I think that what was so great about Jordan's Genesis lectures, which to me is it's one of the finest lecture series I've ever heard in my life, if not the finest lecture series. I thought it was just spectacular. But to contribute to this in Exodus is, I hope it's a way for people from all sorts of different viewpoints to come and be able to arrive at it and see that we didn't agree on everything, and people express doubt and hesitation. And, it allowed a lot of room for discussion, and that's the only way in for me, not prescribing and kind of coercing.
Yeah, I think after, as the Cold War ground on, and as the culture began to shift, especially as the Cold War ground on, especially in the 80s when the Berlin Wall comes down, there's sort of a turn that's made. And of course, the emergence of new atheism at that point. The Bible certainly takes on a valence in the culture, towards the end of the 20th century, that it certainly didn't have even in the 30s and 40s. When, for example, you look at the founding of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, these are all documents that spring out of what had been, let's say, fairly consensus waspy American culture. Of course, during the Roosevelt administration, you have this concerted effort to now bring in Jews and Catholics. Of course, the mid-20th century of this focus on Protestant, Catholic, Jew. Those seem to be sort of the three categories that Americans would think in terms of religious diversity. Yet, it's looking at the work of someone like, say, Tom Holland. You're really hard pressed to, and I think Jordan. I mean, part of the reason why, after I discovered Jordan, I discovered Tom Holland and some of the work that he had been doing. You're really hard pressed to not recognize sort of this foundational role of the Bible in Western civilization, which I hear Jordan talking about again and again, which made the, especially the Exodus. When I discovered the Exodus series, I hadn't been watching anything on YouTube. I mean, what did I know? YouTube was a place that someone would point to me a little video. That's all I knew of it. And then somehow, I think it was through Rod Dreher, I discover there's a University of Toronto psychologist lecturing about the Bible. My immediate thought was, some evangelical has sort of managed to, there's always one or two around somewhere that can keep his mouth shut about certain things. And then, of course, I start watching it and I thought, no, this is something totally different. And then, I mean, part of the reason I gave it as much attention as I did and continue to do so is I noted that he was doing something that conservative religious people had been unable to do for more than a generation, which was especially in those early years, I think before he was sort of framed by certain attacks that were done against him. But for example, if you've got someone like David Brooks making the kind of comments he made about Jordan right after 12 Rules for Life came out,
what were Brooks's comments then?
Well, he was the one that gave the most important public intellectual. He was the one that gave that line in his piece that got put on 12 Rules for Life. But the evolution in the culture that eventually came to present the Bible as a sectarian, as a fundamentally sectarian thing, rather than the way that it has functioned in the West as a foundational document. And one of the things I did appreciate about the Exodus seminar was that it was very much taken that way. I don't know that I would agree with you that it wasn't political. It wasn't political in the sense that Well, of course, Dennis Prager and Os Guinness had their points to make, which was fine because
it wasn't much though. I mean, yeah,
no,
Prager
but
asked me something.
I think it was political in the sense that what I heard from the conversation was an attempt to find the Bible again, but not in a religious frame. It certainly is a religious text, and this has, I think, to do with what has part of my take in terms of what secularity has been, and broadly humanism has been in the West. Has secularism and humanism has sort of been, this Bible light. You could have many of these biblical values, or at least these values that emerged from the Bible in the West, and you didn't necessarily have to go to church or go to synagogue. And so in that sense, and that's what I immediately saw with what Jordan was doing, was saying, these stories and these books are foundational in a way that that isn't necessarily segmented in the way that, say, a Jehovah's Witness coming to your door or an evangelical saying, I'd like to invite you to my church was. And so that, and that's what I've found in the Exodus seminar, that the members were, on one hand, everybody had their particular position on it. And what made your participation in it particularly interesting was almost everybody else at the table, with the possible exception of Jordan, but Jordan's a strange case, sort of spoke from a chair that had a religious posture. And in a sense, some of what I heard from you was, and I think now, again, this is part of the reason I'm curious about your story, was that I did hear some of that voice that was dominant, let's say, in the middle part of the 20th century, that didn't necessarily get too trapped in the modernist fundamentalist kind of fights that religious communities were. But I heard this, and now listening to you, I hear this. It's very clear you're temperamentally open. You're this broad, open desire for productive harmony in the culture. So, I mean, for me, a big part of what I saw in the Exodus seminar and what I've seen in Jordan's work has been an attempt to reintegrate the Bible, but not necessarily as a religious text, in the sense that we sort of assume religion has become in late modernity. So that's,
well, I think, look, one of the ways that I think about this, and I could just talk about my own story, but being raised inside, in some ways, the tightest community that I had was pretty vehemently atheistic, right? Very intellectual. You weren't an intellectual if you believe in God, right? I had other kind of friends, community, Jesuits pecking away at this, but never like forceful. I mean, I had a couple of like, Jews are going to go to hell, whatever, but the culture was so protective. It's like I felt, I mean, as a secular Jew growing up in a community without a lot of Jews in it, I felt wonderfully safe and well received and dealt with, aside from the usual hiccups that anyone gets from whatever else it is. But it's not surprising that for me, coming from that meditation, that my route into spirituality, which I'm going to use now in the vague sense, would be psychological and intellectual. It's Carl Jung for me, right? And one of my closest friends, he grew up the son of a missionary through China, born again Christian. We've been friends, 30 years now. And one of the things that's amazing is I tend to see the world in sort of a Jungian frame, right? Like shadow integration, then anima integration. He sees the world very much through, frame of Jesus Christ and his engagements with that. And we've had this really weird synchronicity with our families, with our struggles with other stuff. And there was a point that I realized that, having kind of dove down with Jung, and Jung, is on all sorts of psilocybin, hallucinogen, like there's all sorts of groovy California adjacent Jungian thought, right? Intellectualism with Jordan. But I reached a point where I was like, oh, wait a minute. Now that I'm down and have this sort of grasp of what Jungian synchronicity means, like I can kind of speak Jesus also, right? Like I can start to understand whichever path you take, so for me, it's through art. It's like, how do you listen to Pavarotti or Aretha Franklin and not believe in God, right? How do you listen to Beethoven, or how do you see Michelangelo? Like, how do you, right? There's this sort of foundational light that comes out, and whichever the means are that people need to burrow down to it, you need to be burrowed down a certain extent to reach this sort of reservoir of shared language. It's kind of like the strong foundation beneath the Tower of Babel we're trying to get back to. And so the means of reaching it, I think that part of Jordan's approach is to say, look, okay, let's say you grew up and you're a self-proclaimed intellectual academic atheist. No problem. Let's talk evolution. Let's talk story structure. Let's talk about why this is meaningful. Let's talk about why Cain and Abel means you never kill the thing you're supposed to aspire towards, because then you're rudderless and have nowhere to aim, right? Let's talk about, and it's all this meaning. And then all of a sudden, I started to have phrases that when I was younger, I'd kind of recoil from, where people are like, well, it's God's way, it's on whatever. I'm like, oh, how nice for them. They're so simple. They turn things over to an imaginary Santa Claus in the sky, right? That's the framework that I came up in and was raised in. And increasingly to go, oh, right, it's not on our time, right? Our job is to set ourselves in order as best we possibly can, and to engage with the fabric of our community in the world, aligned to some higher purpose, in hopes that our engagement with that will unpredictably, yet hopefully, stitch that fabric together in a way that's moving towards goodness and meaning. And when I've been in horrible situations in my life, and I've been in some really tough situations, very dangerous and problematic. One of the questions I ask myself a lot is, if I was writing a character, if I was writing the protagonist of a book, and it's somebody who I admire deeply, how would I write that character to act? And then I'll just act that way, right? Like, what's the most virtuous thing someone could do, even if it's courageous and makes no sense on the prevailing wisdom that anyone's going to say? That's what I'm training for when I'm writing novels. Well, what's the difference between that and what would Jesus do? Except what would Jesus do is a shortcut, because it's already been selected as by far the most evolutionarily successful and grounded hero mythology that has collected all of the hero stories and condensed and embodied them in one frame, right? That's the template we play for and that we move for. And I went last year, I had dear Muslim friends bring me to the site of Jesus's baptism in Jordan. And what was so amazing is the River Jordan has since moved off and away from it, but there's this standing pool of water still right on the steps of this ancient temple. And that temple has been built and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt all the way through time generationally. And you look at that, you're like, wow, that was during all these different eras, all these different religious, everybody thought this spot was important to maintain. It's sort of, it's like in police work when you talk about chain of evidence, right? It's a chain of evidence that goes all the way back. Who knows? Who knows what that is? And so there's this template for religious thinking that if I can put myself in my best open self, and that's also a thing we talked about, of pattern recognition in different fields. I think the pattern recognition, just to give a quick example, because I think it's we've so much lost our way of thinking about liberal arts education and the benefit of different disciplines. But like this, let's talk about just the playing with perspective, right? So you have cubism, right? Like, let's not paint a woman, let's paint a woman's face from 10 different angles. Does that depict a better version of reality beyond our senses? Maybe. You get a nude descending a staircase from 17 angles. Okay. Well, in the 1920s, Faulkner's writing Sound and the Fury. It's one story told from four perspectives, right? You have Rashomon, same thing in film with Kurosawa. He's playing with that. Rippling through, you have Einstein with the theory of relativity, of kind of redefining physics as is relevant to other things. And the most interesting one to me in a certain way, and it's of course is in the theater. Theater catches up to things late, so it's albeit a little bit later on. But in psychology, to me, what's really interesting is our model of psychologist is, Freud sitting there smoking his pipe, and the patient's laying on the couch, right, kind of submissive, and they're speculating, and he's assessing. Well, when you get to Carl Rogers, who most of us know as, the how did that make you feel stereotypical psychologist, he sat the patient up and they sat face to face. So it's embodying a different perspective. And one of the things that Rogers does, or what Rogers thought, was that to listen, to offer unconditional positive regard for your patient, is you actually set your nervous system in a full state that can mimic and reflect theirs. It's not just getting your brain online in a debate. If it's Fox News or MSNBC where you're just pounding with facts, you're trying to allow your body to enter a state that is receptive. And that's not necessarily just empathy, that you lose yourself into their depression, but it's to actually understand, and ideally to reach and to learn. And if somebody has a problem in psychologist's office, to help them determine their own way that's guided out of it. Well, that's the state that we're trying to exhibit. And Jordan and I've talked about this a lot in when you go to a movie, when you read a book. And one of the things that Jordan observed that's so interesting is when you read the story of Christ, we're not just Christ, right? We're Judas. We're the thieves. We're Mary. You're everybody in the narrative. You're opening yourself up. And to open yourself up in a lot of ways to be a container to different ideas or notions, that's one of the things that for me it's such a key aspect of parenting that I wish I'd learned younger. I wish I'd learned better younger. I mean, it's been a process, but when there's a kid who's upset or flailing around, what you want to do is be a container for their emotion. You don't want to suppress it. You don't want to give them an answer right away. You want to contain it. And our ability, I notice this more and more in discourse, in debate, to even be able to withstand. Sometimes it's even an introduction to people. I make a lot of weird introductions. For people to be able to say, look, I disagree with you on a lot of things, but I'll still say it's nice to meet you. And if somebody starts in and says, well, look, I have this opinion about gender and biology, it's well, there's a bunch of studies that show this and blah, blah, well, that's going to undo this. Our ability to be able to just sit and tolerate a different worldview, a different perspective, to have that be part of our nervous system. And then to figure out what we want to integrate, what we can learn. Like, where is that hitting points of assumption we make? Where is that hitting our own blind spots that leave us less open to it? Where are there areas that somebody else's thinking might be fuzzy that we might be able to discuss and shine a light on? Our threshold for leaving the tyrannical and being willing to face the unknown, and we're in a time of massively accelerating change now with AI, with a widening wealth gap, right? With the grip that we have in sort of social media and with the news media, things are changing very, very quickly. And we need to toughen up. And the answer isn't necessarily into this definition of masculinity or this definition of acceptance and diversity. We need to toughen up in our ability to be able to withstand and contain opposing viewpoints without it being an immediate threat where the offense comes. It's like defense to offense. You won't let any of it in. And for me, that's most seminal. And those kind of perspective plays as have rippled through the arts and studying it. So many people go, why should I study liberal? Who cares about liberal arts education? Who cares about Shakespeare? Who cares about, physics? When am I going to use physics? But when you start to understand that these are templates that apply to everything, and a foundational story for all of those templates is the Bible. It's like, you can't really understand Shakespeare, the full colors and splendor of Shakespeare. It's not just about Gerard Manley Hopkins. Like, try reading Shakespeare, listening to Bach without knowing that there's a different type of resonance. And so this sort of more knee-jerk, without doubt atheism that you see very predominant in the culture is so interesting, because it's like, really? Like, there's nothing else? Like, better than Plato and Socrates, and like, it's amazing all the people that you concretely have walled yourself off from. So a big part of it for me is it's a different kind of toughness than we talk about. We tend to get caught up in it's really the ability to withstand and contain another spiritual or intellectual or emotional or psychological state that somebody else is conveying to you, and to be able to hear it. And the amount I learn, I mean, and again, when I do that, a lot of times I'm a novelist. I can get bent out of shape from it because sometimes when I'm embodying something very deeply, it takes a while to come out and shake off and figure out, okay, I understand it. How do I get my brain back online? And what do I integrate? What do I accommodate? What do I assimilate? There's a process of kind of loss of ego into another viewpoint or into a form of art or into a spiritual experience. It doesn't mean that you're then fully captured and that's your new reality and that's your guru and life view or political club. It means that you go and then you come back and then you reintegrate. And people are very threatened by that. Like when I come back from certain experiences or engagements with other people from one side to another side. And, I've been very blessed to have a broad and warm community around me of people who kind of get that. Mm-hmm. But, every time I go do an adventure like Exodus, there's a few people who determine that means I'm no longer, fit to participate as part of, civilized society. And that can happen every direction.
That's interesting.